Hello guys, welcome again. In this tutorial I'm going to teach you about stationary points on a curve. Stationary points. So a stationary point, before I teach you what it is, we just need to have just a sketch of a curve on a Cartesian plane, on a given Cartesian plane. So let me say we have a sketch of a curve that runs this way. This is the curve, it runs this way on the Cartesian plane. Now this we got the x-axis, here. You say this is the x-axis. Then you also got the y-axis. The y-axis is the way it runs. And now the maximum point. This is the highest point of the curve. So this highest point of the curve here, this particular point. So we say this one is the y-axis. This axis, the horizontal axis. This one we call the x-axis. Then we call this one the origin. So this one is the y-axis. Now the maximum point of this given curve, this maximum point, then we have the maximum point, the highest point of the curve is the maximum. Then we got the lowest point here is the minimum point. The minimum point where the curve curves downwards, where it curves upward, I mean. So let me just redraw it. We got something like this, that comes like this, also through the origin, then again comes this way, then curves upward this way. So this point, at this particular point, is the maximum point, the highest point of the curve, and at this particular point is the lowest point, that is the minimum point. So what is the difference between the maximum and the minimum point of a curve? The maximum point, so all lines on a Cartesian plane that runs from bottom left to the top right, these lines runs from the bottom left to the top right on the Cartesian plane, they always have a positive gradient. Then the lines that runs parallel to the x-axis, they run parallel to the x-axis, these kind of lines, they always have zero gradient. Then we have a line that runs from the top left to the bottom right, it goes this way. This line has a negative gradient. So the horizontal line that is parallel to the x-axis got a zero gradient, and the one running from the top left to the bottom right are the one having a negative gradient. So this curve at this particular point, at this highest point, it tends to take this shape of the line drawn here. So from the positive to the zero to the negative. So this point now, from the positive gradient, zero gradient to the negative gradient. So this is the one which is called the maximum point. The curve changes its gradient from the positive to zero to negative. Then the lowest point of the curve, this lowest point of the curve changes its gradient now from the negative. It goes from the negative. Then at this lowest point, it flattens, tends to flatten, but it's not flattening. Then it also curves upward, going upward. So the minimum point curves take the nature of the gradient changing from the negative to zero to positive. Then you also have such kind of curves that they tend, let me just draw it here, they tend to run this way. This is the y-axis, then we got the x-axis. They tend to run this way. So we got the curve that way, we got the y-axis and the x-axis. Now some curves run this way, they tend to take this particular shape, or they can so this particular shape, so it was going upwards, then it tends to flatten, then again it goes upward. Such point, it is neither maximum nor minimum. These points in a curve, these ones are called the points of inflection in a given curve, the points of inflection. Now with that basic understanding, the same curve can happen that the gradient changes from the negative to 0 to negative. So this particular point where the curve, it is not curving upward or it is not curving downward. These particular points are called the points of inflection. So stationary points is where the gradient of a given curve is equal to 0. So the gradient of the given curve, that is the first derivative with x, dy dx. The gradient of that given curve is equal to 0. So we always have the stationary points, the three stationary points. The first one is called the maximum point. I just shown you up there. This is the maximum point here where the cursor is moving. Then you have the minimum point. Then we also have the last point called the point of inflection. So those are the three stationary points in a curve. Now, the point of inflection, the maximum point, we have the curve curving from having the positive gradient, 0 gradient to negative. So the diagrammatical representation of the maximum point is the curve, positive gradient, 0 gradient to the negative gradient. So this is called the maximum, diagrammatic representation of the maximum point. When you come to the minimum point, the diagrammatic representation, we have the curve curving like a basin. So this one is just like a crest, then it goes like a trough, the minimum point. So this kind of line that runs this way have the negative gradient. So it is from the negative, then it curves downwards to have a 0 gradient, then again to positive. So such kinds of the curve that curves from the negative gradient to 0 gradient to the positive gradient, these ones are the ones which are called the minimum point. Now when you talk about the point of inflection, what are we trying to imply? So the curve can either go from downwards, it moves this way, then it flattens, then again it moves upwards. So these are positive gradient, 0 gradient to the positive gradient. So such kind of curve such kind of points are called the point of inflection. On the other hand, also we can have the point of inflection behaving. We have negative gradient to 0 gradient to the negative gradient. So this kind of curve, or this kind of curves, tends to inflect at a given point. They don't have the maximum, neither do they have the minimum. Subscribe for more updates. Let me thank you for the subscribers and for the promotion you are making onto me.